thank you. Again, my name's Burke Meyer. I'm from the Field Museum. I participated in attended a conference here a few weeks ago on the social life of forests, and that's when I met people from the International Studies program or whatever, and they said, well, we got this other institute coming up, and asked if I could do something about climate change. And I'm like, right away, I was like, well, I really don't know that much about it myself. This isn't exactly going to be a highly technical talk, but I hope you're aware of that. But as I always say down over there, I'm a social scientist, not a real scientist. And my background is we use that around the Field Museum quite a bit, because they have real scientists there. We just couldn't find one to come down here today. But teach a biologist or something like that, or that kind of thing. Well, you can find lots of people there that can tell you about the effects of changes in climate, changes in the environment on specific species. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see in our programs, and I guess from the human side. And I think in the title we said why the rainforest is disappearing and its effect on people, that kind of a thing. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and I kind of use this as an opportunity to put some things together about what we've been seeing in our work, primarily in South America. I've done some work in Africa in the past, but I work in a department called Environmental Conservation Programs, and what we do is we actually do the community programming primarily in rural communities in South America, and actually the lowland tropics of South America. And I'm actually out there traveling. I have been, say, 6 months of the year. We're actually in communities, working with people, working with universities, that type of a thing. We're spending a lot of time dealing with these issues, and we're hearing a lot of things, we're seeing a lot of things. And I've just kind of put some of those things in here. So it's a very kind of a human, and I'm including myself in that. It's basically from my viewpoint of what I'm actually thinking about or seeing as well. So anyway, but what I'd like to actually do is, for once, when people from the Field Museum usually talk, you hear a whole lot about the Field Museum, how great it is. I'm going to save that till the last. All right, no, I'm not gonna. But one thing we do is we actually try to, as researchers, as scientists, as people who are working in natural history, we are actually, my department specifically is working in this area of community development, and actually specifically helping people bring about changes in their behavior that can influence their use of natural resources in the environment. And then basically what we're trying to do is involve people in some form of action. In other words, changing those behaviors, and that can help them support like a new natural, like a resource preserve, things like that, parks. We established a lot of parks, things like that. And at the end I can answer questions more about what we actually really do. But one thing I'll do is I'll start a little bit here. This is something kind of in general you could say, is that over the years I've been working in this particular program for about 12 years now. And over the years you kind of start to get this idea, the way people talk when you go into rural communities, something's not right. You'll hear older people that can put things in perspective. I'm saying older people meaning, my age, 50s, that kind of thing. And they're thinking back, 20 years, 30 years, that kind of thing. They're saying, you know what? There's something not right here. There's something going on where we've got these higher temperatures, we've got excessive rainfall, there's these extremes that are affecting people. They don't know what's happening to them because they're down there in some rural, like say, around the middle of nowhere in the boondocks in a tropical rainforest, and they don't read what we get to read. They don't have the internet. They can't necessarily put things in perspective like we can. They don't have the access to the information we have, but they know that something is wrong. And especially one of the things I'd like to make a point of today is we work in these remote areas of the tropical rainforest, the lowland tropics, and you see that one thing people are doing, that they're kind of at the extreme, they're at the edge. Basically, their farming areas are already rather degraded. They've been in these areas of very fragile tropical soils, and a failure of any kind, if there are extremes, a flood, if there are droughts, and there are droughts, these types of things really set them back, and it basically just contributes to this cycle of poverty. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So I made kind of a list of all the things that are going on there. You can kind of see, and you can make a case, these are happening locally, they're happening regionally. You can't say that it's all over South America or all over the Amazon, but you can definitely see changes, right, by fairly good-sized regions in these areas, and a lot of them are actually tied back to human activities. Make a case for that. And I'll also show you in this, I'll show you a lot of slides. We like looking at satellite photos because we found that in many cases, figure this out, a lot of cases, oh yeah, that's the thing, we can kind of see that, I'm trying this, oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, this kind of conversion or whatever from these pristine, intact, intact rainforest areas or whatever is happening at an alarming rate And I've been over 12 years. I'm amazed that I can go back into some of these places. I'm like, there's fields that now, there's areas that are cut down, and it's for a lot of reasons. And that's one of the number one things too, that when you talk to students, when you talk to people, they say, who's the culprit? Who's doing this? Well, it's really complicated. It's really not very simple to say, point fingers and say it's just because of one thing or a lot of reasons for this, and I'll try to cover that, but it is happening. Also, just as a kind of a side note, the previous speaker talked a little bit about this drought in Australia. I saw this somewhere a while back because I was reading about effects on humans, about changes in their environment, changes in their climate, changes in their lives, whatever. And apparently there's social scientists in Australia that have been studying the effects on populations in Australia for the 6 year, I think he says 8 years maybe, maybe it's longer, but they say a 6-year devastating drought in Australia and what that is doing to people's heads. And what they came up with is there's something called ecosystem distress syndrome, which is I never had heard of before. And basically the idea is that this climate, your world that you live in, your natural history, is formerly was something you depended on. It was friendly to you. You understood it. You could depend on cycles. You know, the rains came. You know, the seasons changed normally, and then all of a sudden you've got these extreme changes in your world. Whatever, and people. Some of them accept it, you know, they say, it's part of the natural system, it's just a cycle. Other people are just completely screwed up, they just don't, and they're really distressed about it. And apparently this nostalgia is actually the term they came up with this. It's based it's actually based in some indigenous cultures in the world have names in their languages for this type of thing when it happens in their own environments. So it isn't like it's something that's actually new either. Anyway, to go back to tropical forests, however, one of the things we know, you can go on the internet, you can read books, you know that hundreds of thousands of acres of intact rainforests are lost every year. They're burned down. Basically, that's the way they clear it. It's much too difficult to actually clear land any other way. They have to actually do that also to get rid of the vegetation. And they're obviously losing a lot of your CO2 when you do that into the atmosphere, not into the soil. Basically then, what was happening is that we see a lot of they estimate 25–30% of all these greenhouse gases are specifically related to this burning that goes on. And you know, if you're down in the Amazon at a certain time of the year, usually coming up here, they'll be starting to burn fairly soon, towards July, August, something like that. This goes on for months. I mean, it starts and you can't see anything. And I'll show you some satellite photos after this. One thing that we always say at the Field Museum in our work when we talk about the loss of these very high, these areas that are high in biodiversity, is that people talk about reforestation. They talk about recuperating these areas and somehow bringing them back. Okay, we can use this forest for this, whatever, and then we'll replant it. There are all these schemes about, you know, replanting forests, that kind of thing. The thing is that these areas will never have the same value in terms of their biodiversity, in terms of their fertility. The nutrients are there, the genetic value of those areas will never, ever be able to there again once you've lost it. And people don't realize that. There seems to be a little bit of a tendency also down there to these great big schemes. You hear, oh, we'll just cut this, we'll use this, and people will use it for 25 years, whatever, and then it'll just kind of go back and replant. You'll never get that biodiversity back. Once it's burned, it's burned. Anyway, so other people probably, oh yeah, this is what I was talking about. Other people probably talk about this, but we tend to look at a lot of satellite photos. And my job, I'm actually a communicator, actually. I design educational materials for these programs that we do. And we actually are starting to go out and show, you know, PowerPoints just like this to communities. And people are just, when they see some of these things, these satellite photos, you know what we're actually doing? We're showing them the future in many ways. And that's one thing, it's very difficult for people to imagine. Like, what's my life going to be like 10 years, 15 years, you know, from now, based on what I'm doing today? You know, and you can actually show through images, through these satellite photos, like what's going on a much grander scale that people have no idea what's going on. Basically, and this is an area we work quite a bit here in northern Bolivia. I'll show you another few cases. We work up in this area. It's one of the largest areas of intact forest still in Bolivia. We've sort of chosen that area to put a lot of spend a lot of time up there. We work with the university. We're actually developing an idea to make this probably the first conservation department or state in all of Bolivia, and try to preserve those areas through zoning, like helping the university develop better programs to work at a higher institutional level. But one of the things you can, if you show up down there in July, this is a satellite photo that shows you these red areas are kind of marked out, but those are all fires that are burning all through Bolivia and in Brazil. And this goes on for probably a month, a little more than a month, something like that. And also another thing you can make a case for is that a lot of these fires are accidental. Also, they're intended. Every year we lose thousands of acres. We're talking about almost 100, probably in Bolivia alone, in Departamental alone, up here, you probably lose 100,000 acres to accidental fires that just get out of control. So that's another thing we're actually working with people, is actually help them to understand how to burn in a way that's a little bit more responsible, but control those fires. Anyway, one of the things too that I think other people probably talk about this process, but one thing you can definitely say is that, increasing the amount of land that's being deforested when burned, it's just actually it's a cycle. It's just leading right into the release of more carbon in the atmosphere, right, and then just creates more problems. And this is something that you'll see on a pretty large scale. And then the other thing is, you can see, anybody that's actually looking at this can tell you that degraded forests actually are leading to drier areas. A lot of these areas we say in the Amazon basin aren't necessarily like high canopy rainforests as well, but they're forested savannas and are sort of areas that are being, when you talk about Brazil, that's like these areas where they're making new soybean farms and converting them into more large-scale agriculture. But basically, they're taking these savannas and actually helping to convert these back into bare soils, which it leads to eventually the desertification. And Africa, actually, you see that happening a lot as well. It's not just in South America. Where we work, talk about the Amazon, it's surprising to me how many school kids in Chicago really still don't know, or teachers sometimes who run the field museum don't even know where the Amazon is. Now, we aren't helping that situation. We just did a large exhibit down at the Field Museum last year on ancient Americas, and it actually doesn't even have the word Amazon even in it, oddly enough, because it's about archaeology, but they talk about the whole Americas. And so teachers go in there and they keep asking, well, we've heard about this place called the Amazon. Well, it's not exactly a small area here. We're talking about a pretty large area of the world. And hey, the truth, when you're talking about this whole issue of carbon sequestration and the environment, you're talking about a huge area. And even in South America, you can go into a rural village and you can hear people. They'll actually know that los pulmones del mundo. That's actually something that you're starting to get into people's heads down there. The value of what they're living in there for the first time. This is actually 5-6 years ago. People started to talk about this, and it's slowly getting there down there that they say, wait a minute. We do have something. We have a role here. We have a value, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. It's also these areas, many of them have some of the highest levels of biodiversity on the planet. So that's where we basically spend our time. This is a typical kind of view of what the Amazon should look. Remember, it's not just forest, but it's a huge aquatic system. Yeah, huge draining basin with these really unique, species of plants along these aquatic systems and animals, fish. So we're actually working to try to, at another level, which is help preserve those aquatic systems. Let me see if I get this here. There we go. Now, when you fly over the Amazon and you go into these areas, what you're starting to see, and this is what they talk about, this idea of forest fragmentation, which are small landowners, people moving into these areas little bit by little bit. They farm them for 2 or 3 years. Basically, you go in and you make a new field in the forest, 2 years, 3 years maximum, and you're moving on. Now, you could recycle, and you could actually move around, rotate, through different forests over, say, a 10-year, 12-year 10-year cycle. But a lot of people are actually just moving on, and they don't even actually go back to those areas anymore. So what we're seeing on is just increased fragmentation. And mostly these people that are doing this are people who have been pushed out of other areas. They are on kind of really degraded, poor land already. And they're basically just like, creating, leading into more poverty. We talk about a lot of reasons why forest is being lost in the Amazon and in tropical areas of the world. A lot of it is cattle farming. In fact, they say that's probably one of the biggest factors in deforestation is converting land into pasture for cattle. Brazilians eat a lot of meat. When I go down to Bolivia, we work right across the river from Brazil. I don't think I ever eat so much meat in my life because that's pretty much all there is. And you're actually wondering, like, don't they ever have vegetables here? That kind of, I mean, it's pretty much you're living on meat. It's a cattle industry. It's like a culture that they have, which is huge chunks of meat. And then also, that's also in Bolivia as well. These are photos I've taken in Bolivia, which are new lands that are being converted into cattle farming. And this is Brazil. The other thing in Brazil, it's not just cattle farming, but it's also soybeans. It's a national policy in Brazil, right, to actually compete with the United States for the soybean market. And I don't think that's somebody else, probably somebody who's going to talk about economics, maybe will mention this or whatever. But you'll see this is, I think, about a 10-year-old farm that's up in Mato Grosso, in the department of one of the biggest soybean producing areas, the new ones in Brazil. And you'll find areas that look just like central Illinois. And the thing is that Brazil can do, and you actually have a case where you have U.S. farmers going down there and investing in farmland and actually farming in Brazil now because maybe three crops a year. Where here we just have one. So that's a factor. Population pressures are a big cause of this, and that again is the issue of these small farmers who are there. They're pushed out of other areas, and you'll see this when you look at any maps of the area. You'll see basically whenever, and I'll talk a little bit about roads. I'll show you a couple of things here. But when roads come in, people move out, and it's just slowly. You'll see this kind of process of more and more land being fragmented. And basically converting that land into less productive land. Now, in the viewpoint of a national government, you're putting people on it, right? And many governments, Brazil, in the past, they're changing a little bit. But Bolivia, the government of Bolivia, still today views most of these intact lowland forests that they have as unproductive land because there's no humans on it, basically. And that actually is part of their national policy, is to take people from higher up, the highlands of Bolivia, where there's a lot of poverty up there, where there's a lot of pressure on land, and move them into the lowland areas. There are these kind of repopulation schemes. You'll see. Let me see what we got here. Oh yeah. So that's what I meant. So in other words, in Bolivia, this is a case from Bolivia around Santa Cruz, which is kind of it's really Santa Cruz and a central part of Bolivia is a forested savanna and really considered part of the Amazon. But this is actually an interesting case. You see this. These are mostly immigrants from highland areas of Bolivia who are moving in here, and this is in roughly 10 years. They have a unique kind of farming system where they basically just move out like this, and you can imagine what this is going to be in another 10 years. And actually then they're also moving into other areas of Bolivia. You see this. And these are actually very, very poor people. Right, people move onto these lands, but they're ecologically fragile. Most of these tropical soils lose fertility after 2 or 3 years of use. Making new fields leads to further fragmentation. Oh yeah, and there you start to actually see this as well. I'll mention a little bit here about logging. Everybody hears about logging as being like a fact. It's true, it does contribute to this whole conversion issue of tropical forests because they're sort of like the shock troops. There's people coming in and they're basically putting in roads, they're basically cutting down forests and people follow with that, and then they actually settle on the land, and then it just is a cycle that just all continues as well. Let's see. And then one thing I was going to say is that this is typical. We do a lot of drawings. We show people. Who in here speaks Spanish? You see what this and it's basically the need for doing plan management of your land. And one thing that people don't realize, and it's funny how they don't, but you've got a community, you've got a certain number of people in that community with so much land. Well, what happens when that population increases, and it will? You see, a typical community that's got 10 years ago that had 20 families. Now there's 40 families, there's 50 families, and all those people have kids. Those kids are in the schools. You can actually, when you look at some of the data that they collect about some of these areas in Bolivia, you'll see the schools, how many kids are in the schools. Oh my gosh, there's like 160 kids or something in this one area. Think about all of those kids then that tie into this whole system. But the land doesn't change. The amount of land that they have available to them is just going to continue to be actually have more pressures put on it, more demands put on it. Because they can't, eventually they're not going to be able to move. Yeah, so that's why this whole management issue is a factor for us. That's why we spend a lot of time with teaching people how to do zoning, how to think about a 10-year cycle of rotation. So that's kind of what we do, is what we're actually working at that level with local communities. Deforestation, we're actually experimenting with different ways to show this to people. We started with a forest. You've got like some area where you've actually probably cleared something. You put some fields in. Yeah, hang on. There we go. And then see how the, oh yeah. Forest is kind of goes there. Anyway, that's just we're trying to work on different ways to show people what the future is. And again, like I say, our job and what we do is often that. We're trying to show people what it'll be like if you do this, if you make a decision, make a change in your behavior, or if you don't do something. Again, it's very, very difficult for people to see the future, but basically, we spend a lot of time talking about this issue of fragmentation with people. Also, I might bring in this idea of roads and what the problem is. Roads, this again is Western Pondo where we work. Brazil is up here, Peru is over here. There's already a road here. They're bringing in a new highway. That's one of the, many people are studying that now, but they're trying to predict what the effects will be on the rainforest when they put this huge super highway all the way across the Amazon, because they'll be shipping a lot of goods from Peru back to the Atlantic for the first time in both ways. But then you've got these roads that come in, and you see over the years, and this is actually both representing what has happened in this area and also a little bit more. But basically, again, you start to have on-plan development because there are no rules, there is no zoning. There is no way for communities really to help organize themselves to say, no, we need to go and we need to have so many people come in, you get so much land, that kind of thing. It's basically everybody does pretty much whatever they want, and that's on-plan development. This is a satellite photo of a road in the Brazilian rainforest. You see that just going straight as an arrow across the rainforest. But you can imagine what this is going to be like in another 20 years. He's looking at a lot of maps. One of the resources that I put in my list at the end on the PowerPoint, or the thing you're going to get, is a list of one of the mapping sites that I use quite a bit. We really like to look at maps a lot. You can learn a lot from those about changes over time. And especially we were starting to use those and show those to people more and more. You all know Google Earth. One of the things we're starting to do where we have in Peru, where we have access to the internet or actually download but show people Google Earth and tip up a landscape. Can you imagine somebody who lives their life like down here in the ground and actually see where you live, to see like the mountains and the valleys and the drainage systems and everything, but to see that for the first time kind of from that viewpoint, it's shocking what people, and they're just like, they're totally amazing, they're so into it. It's basically in a way to actually really kind of inspire people to do something. Logging, again, is something you hear about a lot, and logging actually is a big factor in deforestation, causes a lot of environmental damage. Most logging that goes on, especially, well, I'm talking about illegal logging, but even legal logging causes a lot of damage in the world. And we're not just talking about the Amazon. Logging is in Africa, it's in Asia, it's actually as big a factor in Asian countries. It's environmental damage, corruption. In Peru especially, they talk about that actually the logging industry is basically run by a big mafia, and people die because of logging. The wood that people are bringing in here to the United States, the nice woods you use in homes or whatever, you don't know what's happened elsewhere to make that, for you to get a hold of that wood, and it just leads to more development, further deforestation. It's really we could actually have a whole seminar here just about illegal logging in the Amazon or in the tropics or of the world, whatever alone. This again is one of the things we use with communities when we go out. A lot of people, they know there's a problem, but many people don't realize basically a rural person and people living in a village don't really have a way to sell wood legally. It's I guess the administration of that is too difficult for people to get through. So we're working on that side, is to actually make people be legal so there's at least some control. But that's like we're talking about a 10-year, 15-year process to change this whole kind of control of the industry by the illegal part. One of the things that you can say is that you see this is a simple graphic. These are soles, the money that they use in Peru. And you see here's a local person. This is basically about what the cut is of local people. In other words, they're basically giving away If you're living in a rural community, you have access to wood, you're basically just giving it to someone. You know, because it's basically, it's better to get a little something than get nothing. But so what we're trying to do is make that cut bigger, and then this is actually another diagram we use, which is to help people kind of understand the exploitation. The Wepi is an area up in northern Peru. You know, basically you've got these lumber companies that come down, you've got a lot of middlemen in there, and you get local people who basically get nothing for all their labor, and they even own the wood. Communities own the wood. They own the trees, but they don't get anything. And again, it's because these big international companies are probably based in Miami, you know, in big cities or whatever. They basically control everything. So we really talk about actually a big mafia that controls all of that. All right, let me just end up a little bit here with a couple of case studies too. How am I doing on time? Okay?
Oh yeah.
All right, okay. Again, just again, a few more. We really like to look at these satellite photos. We spent a lot of time up here in Pondo. Again, I showed you earlier the thing with the fires. This is where we work. It's surrounded by Brazil on two sides. This is basically a satellite photo of development along that area. And over here in Brazil to the north of the river, that's the red line, and actually the river and the border. You see actually here the tendency for Brazil over that time period, what's happening. It's basically converting those areas into cattle farms. And basically you can go over there, and this is actually, this used to look like this just not that many years ago. You can convert completely an ecosystem and actually a cultural system as well. This is an area, you ever heard of Chico Mendes? The person who was fighting for rights of people to harvest rubber, castanha. Castanha is a Brazil nut, which is basically the main commercial crop in this area. This area once had thriving communities of small, sustainable, you know, like non-wood, non-lumber collectors or whatever of these crops. Basically what you see are large land holdings with just a few people basically owning all of this land with a few cattle on it. They completely destroyed in other words, the social system as well as the ecological system. It can happen. And so again, if people see this, they can see, you can see the future in a way, if you look at what's happened in some of these areas. You know, again, we talk about this, land is just in the hands of a few now. Rather, it used to be kind of more of a collective thing with communities using these kind of jointly held large forested areas. Being able to actually convert this whole area. Oh yeah, that's another thing too. One of the first things I did when I went up to Bolivia is they went over to Brazil and they said, wait a minute, you know what, it's really hot over there. You know, because you can fly over that area, you'll see just a few trees now, whatever. And the difference in the temperature is amazing. And it's proven, it's not exactly, you know, something that's debatable, but you can see that they have higher temperatures, there's far much water, the water quality, yeah.
So are all those communities now in the cities?
They went to the cities. They went somewhere, they're certainly not out there. You know, that's what you say, where are the people? Where did they go? Yeah, they're in the cities, and they're obviously, they have a better quality of life. Depends. I mean, that's a you know, what's quality of life? We get into that, but yeah, right, they're in the cities. Yeah. The other thing I could actually say too is we're talking about changes in social systems and the cultures. Obviously, one of the you always hear is that probably some of these indigenous cultures, Haiti people, they're living in these areas. These forests are full of people. I mean, these aren't exactly like big uninhabited, intact areas without humans. They've got a long history of 8,000 years, 12,000 years of humans living there. And these cultures are threatened by this development as well. This is a case, this is the people in the eastern Peru, whatever, are dealing with loggers, with oil companies coming into their traditional lands. These pictures are from eastern Ecuador, Sucumbíos, and where oil has long been a threat. This is that big old pipeline that goes across all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine like living next to that. But anyway, but these cultures as well are threatened by this type of development. Once you say once the forests are lost, you lose the people as well. You lose their culture. One of the things we would say is when you look at satellite maps of development for Central America, for South America, and you see these areas, you're like, well, why is this big patch of green here around all this development? You're like, well, that's indigenous people. Those are indigenous reserves, or indigenous communities. These are native people there who basically, they really don't develop their areas, but they are threatened because people want to get in there and obviously do something with their lands as well. One of the areas we spend a lot of time up here in eastern Ecuador is with the Cofan group, and we have today Felipe Borman came along with me. Felipe is a Cofan. He's doing an internship at the Field Museum for the summer, and I thought he'd come down here and basically he can kind of check myself a little bit and make sure you know, what I'm saying is okay. But he also, and Felipe can talk about this as well from his side as well. So, but anyway, but one of the things we have tried to do with the COFAN is help them with this, I guess, this management issue. And I'll mention this a little bit. What do we have to do to help local people deal with these threats? One of the things we did in last year with the COFAN was we did what we call a historical mapping project, which is helping people actually reestablish their links with the landscape. I mean, they know it's there, but the thing is not in maps. And obviously, you can't have a decent map. You can't go to national governments. You can't go to the authorities and say, wait a minute, this is where these people are, and they have a right to these lands. It's their historical, you know, their traditional right to use the resources in these places. So we actually see maps as a tool, as a way to actually push really better resource management in these areas and include people in the process. So that's something we're working on now. At one time, the COFAN were all like probably 1,000 kilometers of use of all of eastern Ecuador. And then now, this is true for all of the Amazon. It's also true for Asia, it's true for Africa. Native people, indigenous people are basically have been pushed into these smaller little areas. Little bit by little bit, they may actually get control over or get use of, there we go. Maybe not necessarily total control, but use of reserves, that type of thing. But you see like small little fragmented, like indigenous communities and through Ecuador. And this is a good case right here. This is Ecuador, the COFAN community of Durano. And you kind of grew up here too, right?
I was born there.
Yeah, you was born there, yeah. Basically, what you see are kind of islands of indigenous people throughout the Amazon, where you actually look at these and you say, okay, here's a map of their area, whether that's fine, they're up in here. But when you look at a satellite map, this is 1986, you see it kind of, this is the same area right here, this little dark area right here, right? This is 1996. And you see the roads coming down there, see that, in other words, all the development around. It's like this little island here. You know, what we need, and so now what we're talking about, what about if we started working with other indigenous groups that are up in here, that kind of thing, and made these like a chain, and, you know, maybe actually even made the case for, no, we need to protect more of these lands under their control, like in other words, yeah.
Is the red cleared land?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually fields and areas. There's a lot of, this is also one of the prime areas for oil exploration in this area as well. But those are colonists. Those are people that primarily that come from other areas of Ecuador, usually the highland areas, and they're moving down into other areas. So talk about these little islands. Seem rather interesting. Yeah. And so one of the things we actually are doing within that is helping, I guess, develop skills, help people gain new skills as managers, because that requires monitoring. They talked about the whole carbon offsets program, the market for, you know, where you can buy rights to, or I guess you buy the forest, whatever, to offset the damage you're doing in the United States, for example. And one of the things you could talk about here is that monitoring. In other words, somebody has, from the other side, who's going to monitor that land? Who's going to make sure that it actually is held in good condition, whatever, that it actually is forested so you can be in that market? And that's kind of like the type of thing we can think about in the future. But one of the things that actually people are doing, they're monitoring their own wildlife populations. They're actually conserving resources on their own. But it's just like, in other words, helping the people develop like different kinds of skills. I mean, because people are skilled, but in different ways. You know, and so we always talk about it at the Field Museum, and one of our roles is to kind of, you know, come in and be partners completely with, we're, you know, as scientists, as teachers, we actually then have a partnership with local people to do these types of new types of things. These are just examples of illustrated materials that we use with people. This is COFAN, or is it maybe Siona? But anyway, bilingual materials, helping people, you know, through it, document what they're doing. Anyway, I just threw this up a little bit. A new way of thinking about it is indigenous people, native people shouldn't be just considered to be passive, like something's happening to them. But we should think about them as being actors in bringing about change in the environment, in preserving the forest, and actually helping solve the problem. So we need to actually then give them a voice. We need to work with them, preserve the biological diversity that's there, and that's something we actually do. We try to do some stuff on the cultural part as well. And the other day, there's a political piece to this, which is actually helping them, you know, actually like deal with local governments, or actually national governments. and giving them more, helping to get them more control over what they, with the land that they really, is really theirs historically anyway. Pictures of people like monitoring turtles and things like that down in Zabalo. One of the things I can say is that when you look at indigenous people, this isn't true for all groups, but basically they actually tend to have a kind of a more of a communal manner of preserving resources. In the COFON system, every member agrees to, how they do this, it's every year there's a meeting.
Every end of the year there's
at
a
the end of
meeting
it,
where
yeah.
everybody has to be present, and then they make up new rules and new management plans.
They got, like, actually, in other words, they're managing their own.
Good morning. The areas that you're talking about with indigenous people are the areas that were black on the maps.
Yeah.
That they have. But isn't that almost like preaching to the choir? I mean, they are doing the right thing, so that's why they're staying.
Yeah, we're basically, yeah, you're right, you've got a good point. But actually, we're actually not preaching so much to them, we're actually just helping them sort of develop a management type of a system, I guess, if anything. They sort of know what the problems are. We don't have to talk to, we don't have to tell the COFON too much what the threats are.
And isn't the concern with the people who are coming in to those areas, aren't they coming in because of overpopulation and other things, and they have to move into those areas?
Yeah, and it's just kind of I think it's just kind of an accepted policy for most governments, is to not have controls, let people come in, colonists move into these areas because they're considered not to be inhabited. But there are people there who use them in a different way. You know what I mean? So, I think probably what you were just saying, and a good point would be made, is that the audience isn't to tell about this, or not the COFON, or not using indigenous people. A few of them need some reinforcement. Maybe that's probably part of it, especially the younger generation. You know, some of the COFON that are changing their, you know, I mean, yeah.
I was going to say, but it's also resource exploitation. You know, they're exploiting the resources, not just people coming in that are needing a new place to live. They're seeing the opportunity to take over the land where they're settled. You know, it's both.
And then they're supported by the government who's allowing them to do that.
Yeah, so either the government as a policy or no policy. Yeah.
And whatever kickbacks are.
Right. So then we're up against corrupted individuals, a government with no policy or an okay policy, and then people who are.
And so-called powerless people, most indigenous people are sort of at the bottom. I mean, you know, they get the last of anything. You know what I mean? So basically, you're right. And most people would say that they don't even exist. I mean, that's a big, I don't know if you heard about the recent thing in Brazil, and also this is the case in Peru, whether there are people, like there's a new tribe supposedly, of like uncontacted group. Well, then probably people have known about them all this time, but basically there's some people that deny that there are people living out there, and they say there's no contactados, people living in voluntary isolation. In other words, that they've sort of like, we don't really want to have dealings with the government, we don't want to have, we just want to live out here on where we've always lived. And so that's like another debate or whatever, because some people, it's in the interest of some people not to have them there, but it's in the interest of some people to have them there. So that's a part of it.
And let me just quickly add that, you know, that's part of why this is so important, the work they're doing, is because as these people are forming more concrete management plans, it shows that they have a stronger voice that the government has to recognize. The Field Museum of Natural History of Chicago is down there, you know, getting money from different grants to come down there and work with them. Like, these people are there and they have a right to utilize their land how they've been doing it for, you know, X number, hundreds of years.
We want indigenous communities to have responsibility for their lands, to give them control, and make them, if anything, like partners with the government. Yeah.
A few years ago, we were frequently informed about matters that really came close to genocide in Brazil, as the forests were cut down, and I mean by that people were not dying of starvation because the forests were cut down, but they were just being killed.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to be talked about very much anymore. But what about its actual existence?
There's still some cases where your wealthy landowners, your ranchers, will, you know, like especially troublemakers now. It's not so much kind of a, you know, where they're sending out there exterminating large numbers of people anymore. But say, for example, somebody who's involved in protesting something, that kind of a thing, political agitators, something I say, it's not unheard of still. In fact, I think recently, maybe 6 months ago, there was a case where somebody who was opposed to one of the new highways was actually assassinated in Brazil. So in other words, that's kind of that, you know, rubbing out, getting rid of the opponents, the noisy, opposition or whatever, still happens occasionally, whatever. But it's not on the scale it used to be, where people are actively going in and just hunting people and like wiping out. And it wasn't just indigenous groups either. It was actually small landowners, that kind of a thing, that had some rights to their land, that kind of a thing. So, yeah.
When I was in Costa Rica a few years back, banana plantations have to be replanted every 10 years. And so they were, at that time brought in about 800,000 Nicaraguans a year to work on the plantations and so on. But the banana producers were planning to move to Ecuador because they could pay $8 a day instead of $12 a day to Ecuadorian workers. So I'm wondering, with the World Trade Organization and free trade rules and all of that, the degree to which it sounds nice that indigenous people would try to gain control, but quite frankly, I think big people and big corporations have more.
That's right. It's about this. It's about money. And there are, you can talk about empowering local people or giving them skills and making them part of the process, but at the same time, it's so heavily weighted towards the people, obviously the industrial part, the people with money, the large companies, the wealthy landowners. Those people also are people that are normally involved in the government too. So it's very, very difficult. This isn't exactly like something that's going to change over in 25 years. But we have to start the process somewhere again.
Unless somebody else is going to talk about this at another time, could you go into the extent to which America's large companies, like Archer-Daniels Midland or whatever, might be intimately involved in this sort of thing?
Well, Cargill is definitely involved in Brazil, and so is Archer-Daniels Midland. In fact, they're kind of duplicating some of the U.S. The soybean processing system in Brazil. They have been doing that for the last maybe 5 years, 10 years, something like that. So to the point where it's going to be like interchangeable. I mean, it's the same market. It's the same companies involved in one place as the other. It's just that nobody really knows what, it's less visible what, we know a lot more about what's going on in U.S. agriculture here, obviously, than we do what's happening way down there, kind of a thing.
Well, I guess I'm really asking, to what extent are they complicit in the criminal activity?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. Probably not. You know what? Most of the we were talking about, going back to the thing about having people bumped off and that kind of thing. That's usually like your large landowners. That I know of. I don't know. Yeah.
But the United States trains their military in the School of Americas, which is now called WINSEC, and they list who the identifiable people are that are
they have their ways.
Traitorous,
yeah.
and that they're union organizers, they're small landowners and peasant farmers, because they get in the way of big business. And we're training them how to depose them from their lands and sometimes from their own lives.
Yeah. It's there's you know what, and when you talk about the agriculture, and when I go back to the logging, that's more the logging industry in Peru is probably as violent, and then you link that up then of course with the drug production that's going on in Peru, where that's even more violent. And so I mean, you're talking about it's not a very safe environment for like small people, you know what I mean, that kind of a thing down there sometimes with all this going on.
I have a question about the potential of switching to biofuels. Isn't that going to just increase these problems down here?
Well, you mean down here?
Because
biofuels, people are worried about it.
I mean,
Yeah.
sugarcane and soybeans are used.
That's right. Brazil basically, for a long time, Brazil's national policy is based on producing more ethanol. I mean, they switched over when they made a huge effort many years ago, and before we even did. And obviously, sugarcane is more efficient to use sugarcane for that than it is corn. The whole thing we're doing here with corn is not. Yeah. Well, maybe that's a whole nother talk too, but. Yeah, I can get into that.
But you think it will increase?
People are worried about that. Yes, they are. People are worried about actually, that's right, because people have been producing more biofuels or whatever is just going to contribute to more degradation of
So what we think is the environmentally right thing to do can actually, I mean, how do you measure those trade-offs?
I don't know, because I mean, the thing is, people do need fuel, they need to have jobs, I mean, again, it's touchy. I mean, and I'll get into that a little bit, is how are we. Well, let me touch on something else and we'll get into that. All right, that's how we'll go back to that or whatever. Someone's going to mention this whole thing, bro. How much time? How am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, I can finish up. But this whole thing about this carbon trade is rather interesting. I don't know if you guys know this, You can go to the internet and you can see that like a small community in Amazon, a small community in Thailand, in the Philippines is offering up their communal land, 80,000 acres or hectares, something like that, to these companies to actually enter this market. It's rather interesting. And again, I say it could be actually one way of compensating like these local communities for this. In other words, it puts money into the system. Give them, in other words, pay them, right, not to do something bad with the environment. That's a novel idea. In other words, because Lord knows the oil companies, the loggers, everybody else is in there, they have lots of money. And they certainly will pay people to do something, you know, bad. They could cut down forests, do whatever. Okay? Let's pay them, in other words, for not doing something, but preserving, managing those areas in a sustainable manner. It's a rather interesting thing. Little bit by little bit, we're actually starting to look into that as a viable, a way to actually like fuel this thing or make this thing happen. You know, so, but making people actually partners in this economic system is actually part of the I guess the problem we have to solve, which is giving them these sort of new skills, making managers, kind of make them true partners, I guess. So we're just starting to look into that. I think somebody's going to talk about that too, the carbon market, whatever, later in this. Yeah. So and I don't know that much about it. All I know is I think it's got really good potential. But again, like I say, the other side of that is how do you manage that? How do you monitor it at the other end? Something we're actually looking to get involved in. So we got some choices to make. Again, ethanol. What are we doing here in Illinois? You know, sure, and ethanol plants going on. Well, they're kind of on hold now, or because they're basically people are starting to understand the government thinks it made the U.S. government made sort of a little bit of a mistake. You know, whatever when they basically required so much of the fuel to have ethanol in, they're realizing basically what they're doing to the food market and all the incredible inflation that's happened in lots of markets, but especially out in rural areas as well with land prices. By the way, I'm from a farm in Illinois. I'm from a small family farm in Western Illinois, so I see this all the time. I see it actually out there from our point. But then they talk about this idea that cane is being raised for ethanol production in Brazil, and cane actually is probably a little more efficient in terms of like its use for that. But again, this is a picture of land that has been converted into production for the ethanol market in Brazil. Okay, so it is contributing to that as well. And then the other thing, I just was out at home this last weekend or whatever, and with all the we're getting some really incredible rains out there. We don't have the flooding like they have in Iowa and Wisconsin, but you're seeing places where you've got ditches down through cornfields like this. You could like pretty much lose a tractor in them just from like we're getting 4 inches of rain in an hour, that type of a thing. Incredible amounts of rain. That's got to go somewhere. A lot of this land that's been actually taken out of conservation programs. People are farming right through the waterways, things we used to have, like these conservation practices that were a standard thing. Basically, people are raising as much corn as they can for this. We're talking, I mean, right now we're talking, we say the average is supposed to be 2 to 4 tons an acre loss. That's an acre, you know, is a little bit more than a football field, something like that. So we're talking, and of course that's a really thin sheet when you spread it out over an acre, you know, we're talking, but we're talking about probably, you know, going up to, in Illinois here and all over the Midwest, of 20 tons per acre, simply because of the new production that they're for corn for the ethanol market. And I just kind of drew this up a little bit. I wanted to thinking about this or whatever. So you got 1 bushel of corn, that's about 60 pounds of shelled corn, makes about 2.8 gallons of ethanol. Another way to think about it, this is something you could show students and just present this to them and say, hey, what do you think here? What's going on? Is it, you know, they started a debate with these types of things. The other thing you hear is that probably the corn that you make that went in to fill that SUV tank or whatever probably feed a person for 1 year. So we've got some choices we have to make here about what we're doing, probably on the social side and then the environmental side with what we're doing. And then to finish this up, another thing I'm starting, because I've worked in South America for 25 years or more, and the thing is I'm starting to get kind of interested for the first time in what's happening in my own area. And my own department is actually leading this thing they call the Green Vision plan for Chicago, which is actually maybe from Chicago all the way out to the Rock River and beyond, and actually think about this whole kind of green living space that we live in and connect it up with local food issues and development and so on. And one of the things we saw, what I saw was rather interesting, was this was a projection of urban sprawl back in 1990, what we have in 1999. And what they actually know that you get down even here into Will County and you go down this way or whatever, it's actually quite a bit more than even what they even imagined in 1999. Will County has A lot of growth down. It's one of the highest in the Chicago area. But we're talking about what do you do about this? Because again, it's just like we were talking about in the Amazon. Who's making it? Who's got the money? Who's fueling it? Who's directing this kind of change on this level? You know, it's worth it for us to think about these things. About let's clean up our own act. In other words, before we start getting on people down in the Amazon about what they're doing.
Well, that's a question I had throughout my head the entire time as we keep talking about. You keep talking about the people with the money driving the decisions that are happening, and well, that's us. Not,
We're
not just
letting it happen.
Us in this room today. So how much does the Field Museum jump into the politics of this in terms of educating the local communities about not buying things, about not having too many children? Because all of those things drive these very issues, which then in turn affect.
Yeah, we gotta be careful. Yeah. We do what we can. Especially population control. Ooh, boy, especially if you go to Africa and you start talking about, which it is an issue, you'll be in big trouble with certain people, whatever, talking about population control. But a lot of this is obviously population pressures. Obviously, there's just more people. Especially when, even here, it's Round Lake, up by Round Lake. You know, you don't have to drive along these interstates too much and you'll see these new houses. But, and again, we do what we can. Education. I mean, I don't consider myself to be an environmental educator, but again, the future is, and I see hints of this in young students. I see it, where they're starting to develop these ideas. They're starting to develop things. No, wait a minute, maybe we don't need cars. Maybe we don't need this. Maybe we don't. It's a little bit by little bit. Education, as you guys all know, it's a long process. It's not something that happens in a year. And we know that from our work with rural communities. We're lucky if we can make an impact in 10 years of working in that same place. So it's little bit by little bit. But boy, I don't know, you're dealing with some touchy things here.
That's what's so great about having educators here from K to 16 is hopefully everyone's going to be reinforcing it, so as they move through the grades, they hear it, and they're telling their parents, and they're telling their friends. And
the tools you use to present these things to them, to create critical thinking is what we want. We want to make people,
Many years ago, I had read somewhere that Harrison Ford was member of a group.
Oh yeah, Conservation International.
They were trying to sort of link all the rainforests, because now each country has this pockets of rainforest.
Yeah.
And they wanted to see if they can have all the Central American, South American governments cooperate and sort of make it a one
like
continuous.
A chain or,
Now, do you know?
I don't know that much. I know that they're still trying to do that. And that idea is because if you can connect these areas, because there are preserved lands, there are areas under protection. I mean, you go to the Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, there are a lot of groups that are working on really, really large scale conservation efforts. You're talking about millions of acres of land. But the thing is, to connect them up in this chain, and it is there. I don't know, but you also need people like Harrison Ford, like big names to draw attention to this stuff. I mean, he's a movie star, but at the same time, people sort of pay attention. Sure. You know what I mean? When you got people like that involved, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Okay. Any question?
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the stuff you're doing. I'm awed by it, in fact. But I'm also really surprised because I had no idea that the Field Museum would enter into politics in the way that you have.
Yeah.
Which I think is great. But where do you get your funding?
We get funding from foundations. Obviously, we get a little bit of money from within the museum, but it doesn't really help us for anything. It's like, pencils and paper kind of a thing in an office. But basically, we get money from some of these larger foundations. The Gordon Moore Foundation, Intel, had been a big supporter of conservation efforts, and now they're kind of going down a little bit, and they're putting their money into other things.
Is this typical of museums that they would go out and get so involved, not only in conservation?
We get asked that a lot. I was hoping somebody would ask that. Because yes, as a natural history institution, we are an educational institution. Our job is to, really kind of educate people or whatever, that kind of thing, about the world. One thing, it makes sense when you think it doesn't really do any good to keep studying the world and collecting information about the world, and that includes biological material, artifacts, whatever. If it's going to hell, you know what I mean? Here or there or anywhere. I mean, you have to have some action somewhere, I suppose. And that's an odd thing for having an apartment like ours. this is actually, here's where I get into the propaganda, I promise you that we talk what we do. But basically, and I actually threw this in here because we talk about the Amazon basin where we work, and we actually are doing research, which then leads into driving some kind of a political side to it, which is, you know, establishing new protected areas. And then the part I work in, which is actually helping implement, you know, working with local people to actually be part of that process. So we're trying to get there. But it's, I'll tell you, they get in trouble a lot too, because obviously you're seen as, was this institution from Chicago, what are you doing, why are you here? Yeah, I mean, it's touchy. We don't talk about population control, that's for sure.
Yeah, my follow-up question was that since what you're doing there sort of threatens the logging, the mining industry.
Well,
have you guys been threatened, or people's lives?
No, we try to keep a low profile and say, you know, we try to push other people in the front. Or whatever. Well, but I tell you what, though, there are some things, especially what you mentioned about the logging, especially in Peru. We work up in Iquitos, Peru, up in here. Iquitos is up in this area of Peru, and that's one of the centers for illegal logging in the Amazon. And my God, if somebody, I mean, if somebody took a, they found out here, we do help people with materials. Our name is on things. I mean, but you know, we get in and get out. So. You know.
But you had mentioned about Chico Mendez, and Chico Mendez was shot down by
a landlord. Yeah, right. People get assassinated. It's tough because you're talking about threatening people's ways of life or what they're accustomed to. That's right. There's cultures. These are cultures of land use or whatever, and hard to change. Yeah.
It's very fascinating what you're discussing here. I'm just wondering, do you think National Geographic would do a story on you guys?
The Field Museum would like that.
Yeah.
They love them. Yeah, they would love that.
I think that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
I mean, more media exposure to the kind of work you're doing.
We get some. They haven't done anything about the Field Museum, and I don't know if they're, I mean, you know, they could, but yeah. We were lucky sometimes to get, well, you know, media support is obviously important for this because it means money. It means foundations, people getting, Field Museum runs on donations and money from outside sources. Yeah.
Do you have any real-life case studies that we could use in our courses?
Real life, like what? What would be it?
You know, the effect of deforestation on a certain village and what happens. And
boy, it's, you know, it's like anecdotal. It's all over little pieces of things. You know, I can find some. I don't think I have anything in my resource thing about that. Let me think about that. Like a real, like here's a real, like just one village and what happened to them kind of a thing.
I can actually refer.
Maybe some.
I can't think of the title offhand. It's an anthropological study of 15 different tribes. There's actually, I think, 4 or 5 in South America focus, and one I know specifically relates to deforestation. I can get that to Jamie through email and have her link it up.
Yeah, there are a lot of academic articles about anthropologists who have gone in and studied like the changes. I mean, you'll find cases in Ecuador where there's whole villages living on canned sardines. I mean, all animals are gone. The land has just gotten to the point where there's nothing there anymore. They just basically can only buy food. You can imagine such a thing. I mean, there's cases. There's all different kinds of levels of that type of a thing. I can't think of anything. Yeah, any more?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're doing is really amazing, and I know we have a colleague where we teach who also is very much involved in contact with communities and this sort of a project. And I think what you said earlier about the complexity of, you know, who the culprits are, I think we have to keep in mind. And I guess, but I'm reacting somewhat, perhaps politically here. That is to say that we do need to talk to the indigenous populations. We do need to help strengthen their ability to fight back against encroachments, right, and to do it in an environmentally responsible way. We do need to think on a personal level about, you know, our own consumption of resources. But who's challenging the fact that Archer Daniel Midlands and Cargill, for example, have an 86% profit increase at a time when there's global food riots because corn is being used for ethanol? I mean, how do we get, because that's really...
Present that to the students and let them solve it. They're younger, they got more time on their hands.
We need to keep that on the radar screen, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because this is all stuff that, on the one hand, it's like, wow, those people are so far away, and then I'm so little, right?
Yeah,
I can do this.
But together, obviously, people have power or
but
whatever,
there's
and that's part
also
of
this huge thing that we just have to stop dancing around, you know, we really have to.
Yeah, that's a whole nother, that's gonna probably come up a lot here. What can you actually do about it, you know, so. I was gonna say I'm done actually, anything, and then, I was gonna say I was gonna put up one more thing real quick. Okay, and these are the resources. I put this on the CD or whatever you're gonna get, right? And basically, and I look, this is one, the NASA site that has all the satellite images. It's incredible. You can see changes in things over time. You can see like status of things. That's a great one. The Union of Concerned Scientists has a status of global warming issues or something by region. And it's really good, the one especially here for the Midwest or whatever. So I can look at that. Amazon Watch is one of the, there's a lot of groups, foundations that specifically work with indigenous groups or native groups on these issues in South America. At the Field Museum, we don't really have anything. This isn't like an issue. I couldn't find anything we had like in terms of really put you, other than the fact they have like an art, they have an exhibit that just opened about disasters. What's it like to be inside of a tornado? But it doesn't really touch on why. Why do we have disasters and link it to climate change? I think because they did it, you know, I don't know, a while back and it wasn't an issue then. So, and then they have an art exhibit about melting ice, envisioning change, with something with it's an art exhibit, so it doesn't really explain too much. And then really, really important, if the students are really, I mean, if they would like to know, take on a cause or look at something more closely, go to the COFON website. They have a really excellent website about the things that they're doing, conservation, about preserving their culture, that kind of a thing. And it's the foundation for the survival of the COFON. Because we talk about endangered plants, animals through the Amazon, that's true. The trees are endangered, they're cutting down the rainforest. But at the same time, cultures are endangered as well. They're probably as threatened as anything else. So, okay, I hope that just kind of covers, just kind of threw everything.